dedicated to delivering value and exploring great books from around the world. Hi, this is Sally with Book Talks. Today we're diving into a book from the Oxford Very Short Introduction series titled Capitalism by British scholar James Fulcher. The word capitalism seems like everyone knows what it means. But if we get down to the roots, what capitalism really is and how it originated, not many people can actually explain. This book we're exploring today aims to make clear the entire story of capitalism, from its origins to now. But let's start by hearing three stories that illustrate what capitalism is all about. The answer lies within these stories. First story. In 1601, off the coast of South Africa, four ships were heading east. This was the first expedition fleet of the British East India Company, tasked with trading gold for spices in the East, a highly risky long-distance venture. The fleet could face storms at sea or clash with Dutch or Portuguese ships. Once in the East, they could run aground on reefs, sink, or have conflicts with local people. So during the entire journey, the shareholders back in London were filled with both anticipation and anxiety. Luckily, 18 months later, the fleet returned successfully with Indonesian pepper, and the shareholders made almost double their investment. Second story, in 1795, two Scottish men, James and John, set up their first textile mill. They raked in huge profits within just 5 years. The company's capital increased 10 times. By 1820, they had 3 factories and were the top player in Manchester's textile sector. However, more competitors were jumping into textiles, and the number of UK textile mills quintupled over 2 decades. Profits in the industry were pushed down to rock bottom. Competition pushed James and John to pour money into inventing new machinery and boosting efficiency. Meanwhile, they cut workers' wages and extended their shifts. Their factories employed 100 kids under 10, working from 6 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. every day. Now, the third story. On February 23, 1995, the Nikkei index crashed by 330 points, leading Barings Bank to lose £143 million in a single day. The mastermind was Nick Leeson, a trader at the Singapore branch, who funneled Barings funds through a secret account into risky futures and options trades. As a result, he bet wrong. Leeson caused a total loss of £470 million for Barings Bank, leading to the collapse of this historic commercial bank. All right, that concludes the three stories. On the surface, the business activities in these three stories seem unrelated, but we can capture their common core with just 2 words. What are those 2 words? One is investment, the other is profit. First, let's talk about investment. For maritime trade, you need to build ships, hire sailors, prepare food and fresh water, and also prepare the payment, which is gold bars. All of this requires a huge investment of funds. And to set up a textile mill, you need to buy land, build factories, and purchase machinery. That's also investment. In the third story, futures and options require capital, which is also investment. Now, looking at profit, whether it's the shareholders of the East India Company or Barings Bank, they take risks to gain profit. For example, Barings Bank's collapse had an even more critical reason. They engaged in financial innovation by removing the firewall between the banking and securities departments. Why did they do this? It was all to chase greater profits. In fact, not just the 3 business activities we've discussed. Almost all economic activities in a capitalist society can be described with the words investment and profit. So back to the initial question, what is capitalism? The author believes it is investment behavior aimed at obtaining profit. The first story illustrates commercial capitalism. The second is industrial capitalism. The third is financial capitalism. These are the 3 fundamental types of capitalism. Next, we'll address the question, why did capitalism emerge in Europe? Not only are European scholars interested, but Chinese readers are too. In the mid to late Ming Dynasty, capitalist sprouts appeared in China's southeastern coast. But why didn't it develop into capitalism? Or, to put it another way, what were the unique aspects of 16th century Europe compared to China or other civilizations? The author analyzes this from three levels. First, the economic level. In Europe, there were relatively independent and autonomous cities, such as Genoa and Venice in Italy, Bruges in Belgium, Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Hamburg in Germany, and so on. These cities formed a trade and financial network spread across Europe. In these cities, commerce and finance dominate, spurring key innovations in the capitalist economic system. For instance, inventing bills of exchange, establishing commodity and futures exchanges, creating the joint stock company system, founding stock exchanges. Next is the political aspect. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe never established a unified empire but formed a diverse political structure with long term competition among various nations. On one hand, competition between nations provides more options for merchants or entrepreneurs. When political and economic conditions worsen in one region, they can migrate elsewhere, ensuring the spark of capitalism doesn't die out. On the other hand, under this fragmented political structure, feudal power was decentralized, so states couldn't solely rely on military or bureaucratic means to extract wealth. They needed economic methods, cooperation from the industrial and commercial classes, and even borrowing from financiers, creating a more relaxed environment for capitalism's growth. Finally, on the ideological level, the Protestant Reformation that emerged in 16th century Europe fostered a faith well suited to capitalism. Protestantism promoted asceticism and saving. It taught that diligent secular work served God, deeply shaping European attitudes toward labor and money, thus enabling capital accumulation. Combined, these three factors gave European society a unique structure without a dominant elite class. And in this social setup, the most appealing way to gain wealth wasn't military conquest or power alliances, but engaging in economic activities. The book's author argues this is capitalism's fundamental origin in Europe. And next, let's cover the developmental journey of capitalism. Industrial capitalism took shape in the 18th century, marking capitalism's formal establishment. Since then, its evolution has unfolded in three stages. The overall trend can be summed up as first chaotic growth, then increased government control, and finally the removal of most regulations. Industry appears to have completed a full circle. Now, let's delve deeper into this process. In capitalism's early phase, businesses were mainly handicraft workshops and small factories competing freely. Governments attempted interventions like restricting child labor hours and setting wage and food price controls. However, with the rise of liberalist thought, it advocated that governments shouldn't interfere in economic activities. Wages and price levels should be determined by the market itself. Influenced by this philosophy, various government regulations were gradually abolished. But by the mid 19th century, internal and external conflicts in capitalist countries began intensifying. On one hand, they needed to handle international competition. On the other, they had to ease tensions between capitalists and workers. Against this backdrop, capitalism entered its second phase. Governments began strengthening social control. How exactly was this done? Politically, it involved implementing corporatism. Corporatism, corporate as in governing, ism as in cooperation. Corporatism meant forging compromises between capitalists and workers to achieve class collaboration. Governments consulted unions and capitalists on policies, while both sides supported government controls on prices and wages. Simultaneously, voting rights expanded. Workers gained national parties like Britain's Labour Party. These measures eased social tensions. Economically, state enterprises ran utilities like gas, water, and transit with government subsidies. This policy aimed to provide more equitable services at lower costs to citizens. Governments also introduced pensions, unemployment benefits, free healthcare, and education to reduce wealth gaps. This control system operated until facing a crisis of confidence in the 1980s. First, corporatism collapsed as price and income controls faced joint resistance from capitalists and unions. Second, public services failed to meet citizens' expectations. Amid this, liberalist thought resurged. In 1979, the Conservatives won Britain's election. Thatcher's rise marked capitalism's third phase, launching global liberalization. Thatcher's policies focused on four areas. One was cutting welfare, for example, limiting unemployment benefits, reducing education funding, increasing fees. Second, ending public services by privatizing state-owned enterprises. Three, reducing economic restrictions, like removing barriers between financial sectors to allow universal banking. 14. Restraining unions to free up labor markets. Overall, these policies aimed to strengthen market forces. That concludes our introduction to capitalism's three developmental stages. Since this book primarily uses Britain as its model, did other countries follow identical capitalist paths? The author believes they're broadly similar but with differences. Beyond Britain, capitalist development mainly took three models: Swedish, American, and Japanese. Let's explore each one now. First, the Swedish model has two standout features: centralized cooperation and welfare. And what does centralized cooperation in capitalism mean? It means labor and management in Sweden each forms centralized representatives. Workers established unified national unions while employers created a national employers federation. Thus, cooperation issues like wage negotiations could be resolved centrally through these two organizations. This proved more efficient than British-style corporatism. Therefore, during regulated capitalism, Sweden experienced labor management harmony. Now, the second feature, welfare capitalism. Compared to Britain, Sweden's welfare system was broader and labor relations more equal. From the 1960s to 70s, Sweden halved the income gap between high and low earners. In the 70s, Sweden also enacted laws protecting workers' rights and giving them voices in company policies. Swedish unions focused not on job protection but retraining unemployed workers for new employment. Moving to the American model, it also has two labels: individualism and corporate capitalism. First, individualism. Americans widely believe in personal effort and strongly endorse free market principles. American workers have weaker class consciousness and less socialist influence. This manifests organizationally through much lower union membership rates than in Europe. Moreover, American unions follow pragmatism, avoiding social transformation or collective class interests. Their goals are highly realistic, securing the best contracts for members. Now, the second label, corporate capitalism. Among major capitalist countries, the U.S. has the largest population and biggest domestic market, which naturally fosters large corporations. Initially, U.S. companies expanded through horizontal mergers. After the 20th century, they shifted to vertical integration, consolidating all production stages within the company, thus giving rise to corporate capital expansion. Its characteristic is that commercial joint stock companies dominate national economic and political life. In Europe, governments provide welfare, while in the U.S., companies deliver it through market mechanisms. Finally, let's discuss the Japanese model. Japan's industrial capitalism began with the Meiji Restoration and has two key features. The first feature is that it was part of a national strategy led by the government. The Japanese government removed feudal barriers, heavily invested in industries like railways and shipping, established a modern banking system, and set up model state-owned enterprises. Some of these state-owned enterprises played a crucial role in Japan's industrialization. The second feature is the emergence of zaibatsu firms with close government ties. These family-controlled, government-backed businesses operated across nearly all sectors of Japan's economy, including industry, trade, and finance. These two features resulted in a more controlled form of Japanese capitalism, making it economically and politically more stable. And that concludes our discussion on the three models of capitalism for today. Now, next, let's explore a trend in capitalism over recent decades: global capitalism. Actually, global capitalism isn't a new phenomenon. From its birth, capitalism began spreading worldwide. The age of exploration in the 15th century established connections between Asia, the Americas, Africa, and capitalist Europe. Subsequently, European colonial rule brought almost the entire world under capitalist influence. What we call global capitalism today originated after World War II, continuing a centuries long historical trend. The most visible manifestation of global capitalism is the diffusion of capital and industries from traditional industrial nations to emerging economies. For example, U.S. manufacturing moved to Mexico, call centers relocated to India, and Japanese capital flowed into the Asian tigers and Southeast Asia. Similarly, since the 1990s, China has attracted the most foreign capital and industries, with this diffusion led by multinational corporations. However, the author argues this doesn't mean multinationals have become international organizations. They remain headquartered in their home countries. Oh. They exploit cheap foreign labor, but ultimately repatriate profits home, failing to erase national identities. Moreover, the author contends global capital flow is largely illusory. In reality, most capital circulates among a small cluster of wealthy nations and select others. For instance, in the 1990s, one-third of foreign direct investment to developing nations went to China, while all of Africa in 2000 received investment equivalent to Finland's, a nation of 5 million. Mhm. I Since the 1960s, global capitalism boosted some emerging economies, making many believe international gaps were narrowing. But the opposite occurred. In 1820, the world's five richest nations were three times wealthier than the five poorest. By 1992, that gap had widened to 72 times. Thus, under global capitalism, rich nations grew richer, while poor ones became poorer. The international divide has deepened. That concludes our discussion on global capitalism. Finally, let's contemplate capitalism's future. We know capitalism's history is riddled with crises. From 17th century Dutch tulip mania to the 1930s Great Depression, 1970s oil crisis, 2000 dot-com bubble, and 2008 financial meltdown. Each crisis leaves capitalism teetering, seemingly worse than before. So, will the next crisis bury it? The author views crises as capitalism's norm, an ever-evolving system where change breeds disruption, contradictions, and inevitable crises. Yet, capitalism innovates powerfully and recovers robustly as new products and core technologies continually reignite growth. Take over production crises. While shutting factories, survivors expand production, hire workers, and spark new demand. So crises may come again, but capitalism won't end anytime soon. That concludes our discussion of capitalism. Reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.